I've been in crypto since 2012 or so. So I've sat through three horrendous, soul-crushing bear markets of it just being down only and me losing my sanity a little bit. And I've also sat through some of the most euphoric up-only years over the last decade. Is your strategy you just don't give a shit? You're buying no matter what, like periodically?
Yeah. 99.95% of the carbon emissions in the world come from something other than Bitcoin energy usage. So ultimately, the hardcore environmentalists are going to target cars and airplanes and buildings. And, you know, if you've seen those islands in China where they built like 50 skyscrapers that were empty and then they demolished them all, that's an example of a real climate problem, overbuilding and destroying. The human race has never had an effective money, a mathematically sound, thermodynamically sound money. Gold was the closest thing, but it was way too inefficient. It bleeds energy too fast in time and in space. Just showing them how much more efficient, how much higher the quality of living is should they adopt a better energy technology.
Today, 2 hours ago, it was reported Michael Saylor steps down as MicroStrategy CEO. Company takes $917 million charge on Bitcoin. MicroStrategy announced on Tuesday its founder and CEO Michael Saylor will step down from the top job and take a new post as executive chairman focused on the company's Bitcoin strategy. Fong Le, the company's president, will take over in the CEO role. MicroStrategy reported quarterly results that were light off Wall Street estimates on Tuesday, with revenue coming at $122.1 million against expectations for $126 million. Losses in the quarter totaled $918 million, with $917.8 million attributable to the company's Bitcoin holdings. So he basically lost almost $1 billion. And basically the bulk of this, 917 out of 918, is attributable to the Bitcoin holdings. In a statement, MicroStrategy said Saylor will focus primarily on innovation and long-term corporate strategy while continuing to provide oversight of the company's Bitcoin acquisition strategy. As executive chairman, I will be able to focus more on our Bitcoin acquisition strategy and related Bitcoin advocacy initiatives, while Fong will be empowered as CEO to manage overall corporate operations. Now, what I truly hope is that this guy does not think that he's going to be the next Michael Burry. What I hope is that he doesn't think that Bitcoin is magically going to turn around and he's going to be vindicated after having lost damn near $1 billion. Because if that's what this guy thinks, if he thinks he's going to be considered the next Michael Burry for losing damn near $1 billion. Now, mind you, Michael Burry made a lot of money by betting against the housing market, which basically he understood the government was lying about, the banks were lying about, and the news was lying about. This guy had the news, the government, and the banks on his side. And all it did was create a huge derivative in cryptocurrency that there were a lot of people who were stupid enough to buy in, and especially once they bought in over the $50,000 range, and now they're all sitting on losses. So, you know, he is taking this role as, CEO, but God forbid Bitcoin drops again. They may have to put him on suicide watch. But he's not what I want to talk about the majority of this time. I want to talk about the American household debt hitting record $16.2 trillion as mortgages, credit cards, spending swells, and delinquencies creep up. Now, I've tried to offer strategies for dealing with debt, like specifically how to properly use a credit card in order to achieve a perfect score and in order to ensure that you have excellent credit and you're able to do anything you need to do. Some jobs demand credit checks now. They will not hire you if they consider you a credit risk. There are health insurance companies that check your credit before they give you health insurance. There are auto insurance companies that check your credit before they give you auto insurance. It's one thing for the debt shamers on YouTube to tell you, oh, you don't need credit. You don't need a good credit score. You could just pay for everything in cash. It's one thing for them to tell you that. But then if you actually come back and say, yeah, but what about if I apply to this job? Or what about if I need auto insurance? Or what about if I need health insurance? Or what about if I absolutely need a loan for something that I absolutely do not have enough money for? That's when they go silent. For example, all the people talking about how easy it is to save up $1 million. Yeah, well, I've never, ever seen a single one of them saving up $1 million. I've never seen it. They could probably say they have it, but I've never seen it. So all of that is basically bullshit. The more you talk about it, the more you argue about it, you come back to the circular conversation of the fact that you're just talking smoke. But the reality is that you're going to need to have a good credit score. And some people, they've been programmed to run this bullshit about, oh, yeah, well, you don't need it. And that's just for debt slaves and blah, blah, fucking blah. The thing about it is you cannot be in debt and you can still have an excellent credit score. You cannot be in debt and you can still have excellent credit history. You cannot be in debt and you can still have excellent credit availability. But these people don't understand that because they don't have it. Ask them to lend you $1 million so that you can buy a house in cash. I guarantee they can't fucking do it. In fact, most of them are renters. So anyway, and they're going to be permanent renters. Anyway, and you know, I think it's just so funny because I keep thinking back to how I was trying to convince people that before COVID, they needed to buy a house if they could, not if they couldn't afford it. But the reality is a lot of people, they just sat on whatever money they had. They think, oh, yeah, well, there's going to be a housing crisis. I was like, no, there's not. There ain't going to be no housing crisis. We had a housing crisis back in 2008, but it had nothing to do so much with the houses as it did with the mortgages that were underpinning them. That ain't going to happen again. Foreclosures right now are low. So either you're going to be a permanent renter or you're going to be saving in vain to buy something that you absolutely can't afford. So really quickly, I'm not going to waste too much time on this. It says total housing debt jumped by $312 billion or 2% to $16.5 trillion at the end of the second quarter, pushing balances about $2 trillion higher than at the end of 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the NY's Fed quarterly report on housing debt. In a statement, the New York Fed's Jolie Scally attributed the swelling debt load to robust increases in mortgages, auto loans, and credit card balances, as high inflation drives up the price of goods and services at the highest rate in 40 years. See, the shame of it is like the higher the price of these items, the more they add on market adjustment pricing and they charge you $5,000, $10,000 more for certain things like cars, or even when it comes to houses, they charge you $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, maybe even $50,000 more than it should be worth. The sad thing is that because it's credit and people don't have the discipline not to simply buy shit they can't afford, what ends up happening is you just run up debt. And you don't care because for the most part, that debt is in thin air. It's just numbers. You're going to have to work to pay it back, but it's just numbers. It says, though mortgage originations declined slightly in the second quarter as higher interest rates curbed home buying demand, mortgage balances fueled much of the overall debt increase, climbing by $207 billion to stand at $11.4 trillion at the end of June. Meanwhile, credit card balances jumped by $46 billion, or 13%, representing the largest increase in more than 20 years, the second biggest driver of overall debt last quarter. As concerns mount over the state of the economy, Scally warned the Fed is seeing delinquencies rising modestly across all debt types and particularly among low-income borrowers, though she also notes household finances appear to be in a strong position. In a potential sign that foreclosures are beginning to return to more typical levels, about 35,000 people saw new foreclosures on their credit reports, jumping more than 45% from the previous quarter. The government said new quarterly foreclosures averaged about 100,000 before the pandemic, but have since remained low due to various moratoria prohibiting the repossessions. So as I said, Foreclosures have not increased because of these moratoriums. Now, on a state-by-state basis, different states have looked and seen how they're going to deal with this. Because the reality is the states don't want to throw these people out of their houses, because the reality is there's nobody to replace them with. They know that if they can hold on to these people just long enough, all of that debt can be backloaded onto those people's loans. So they can always get that money later down the road. The moratoriums are doing nothing but increasing the people's mortgages for the most part. So if the person wasn't paying their mortgage through these moratoriums, they're going to just owe more principal and they're going to owe more interest over time. And that's basically what it comes down to. The economy quickly bounced back after COVID-19 recession in 2020. Consumers have remained fairly resilient throughout, even as the Fed's efforts to fight inflation fuel fears of a looming recession. Federal Reserve is raising interest rates. Raising interest rates has the effect of making houses even more unaffordable, because now you have lower inventory, high demand, and the high interest rates make these houses, just like the one I showed you in the video that was $750,000 for a piece of shit house. It makes it more unaffordable. 9.1% was the inflation number. That was the annual inflation rate in June, hitting a worse than expected 40-year high after an unprecedented surge in gas prices. Okay, that's the end of the story. The last thing that it did say that I didn't read was particularly those in lower income areas are beginning to show distress on their debt, with delinquency rates among zip codes with the lowest income creeping up 2.5% from roughly 2% last year. So here's the simple reality. I don't really believe, and I guess it's easy to prove that it's true, but I don't really believe that we ever really got out of the 2008 housing crisis. What the 2008 housing crisis did was it basically stripped most people of their equity and put them underwater. And so it depends where you live. If you live here in New York, if you bought a house in 2008, that house was probably somewhere around $400,000 to $500,000. But if you bought it in 2009, that very same house, chances are you probably got it for half that because the housing market collapsed. But if you waited and you bought that house in 19 or 2020, you were going to definitely pay more than you would have paid in 2009. And if you waited until right now, you'd probably be paying 3 times what you would have paid in 2009. So the reality is, people who already own property, especially if they owned it and the mortgage was paid off, those people are sitting pretty. Those homeowners have equity. And right now, just like I have, you have these people putting these fucking signs on your house asking if they could buy your house and shit, which I take and I burn as tinder. I take them, put them on my grill, and I just set them on fire, and I just watch them burn. But if you're a person who waited until now to try to buy a house, chances are it's going to cost you so much money. You're going to end up paying 2 to 3 times what the house is worth. It's just like when I laugh at these car dealers who are trying to sell cars for $10,000 and $15,000 more than they're worth, even $100,000 more than they're worth. That's just the reality. So the problem is you can either do without and try to be a renter and then end up paying top dollar for rent, or you can bite the bullet and buy one of these properties and most likely end up underwater. So all of this, whether you're talking about Bitcoin and these idiots like Michael Saylor, all of this is basically caused by poor government policy. We're not in recession. We're not in recession. We're in what's actually called stagflation. And I'm going to show you the difference. Recession specifically means that you have 2 consecutive quarters of shrinking of the GDP. It's based on GDP. Stagflation, however, is the word you need to learn and use. Stagflation means that you have high inflation. I think we can all agree inflation right now is the highest it's been in 40 years. The Federal Reserve and the government, when they talk about it, they give you the number 9%. But in reality, it's actually probably double that. It's probably 18%. But I can't really argue with the government because they're just going to put out fucking lies anyway. Low GDP. Well, you tell me, during the COVID 2020 and COVID 2021, GDP had to have been down. If you're measuring consumer spending, GDP had to have been down simply because we weren't producing anything. People were locked up in their fucking houses. They weren't doing shit except buying Netflix and buying stuff to keep them from losing their fucking minds. So yes, GDP, and by the way, the recession numbers that we've seen that the government refuses to admit to have already shown that we have low GDP, or at least lower GDP. High rate of unemployment. Well, of course, the government lies about that too. They don't tell you the real rate of unemployment. We know that there's a lot of businesses that have problems getting these people to come back to work. We know that a lot of people have either been laid off or are getting laid off. Now, see, I'm fortunate because owning my own business, I'm in no danger of being laid off because the only person who could do it is me. So fuck that, that's not happening. Recession in most of the economic activities is part of stagflation. Well, let me ask you this. If a box of eggs costs you $4, if gas is costing you $4 a gallon, if a house is costing you more than it's ever, if a house that's only worth $200,000 costs you $750,000, well, you tell me we have a housing market recession, we have a shopping recession, so consumer spending is down, and we have other forms of recession. So they can't lie about it. They can't lie about it. We're in recession. We know we're in recession. They can't lie about it. But the most important part of stagflation, poor implementation of government policies. When you are passing out welfare checks and stimulus checks and telling people to go out and spend that in order to boost consumer spending, when you're passing out these welfare checks so that idiots like this can take your welfare check and claim that you're going to get some huge return on his Ponzi scheme, what do you call that? I call that poor implementation of government policies. I call putting sanctions on a country that was sending us 600,000 barrels of oil a day a poor implementation of government policies. I consider putting sanctions on a country like that to be really, really, really stupid, especially when you're literally driving Europe into recession. I consider trying to start World War III by antagonizing the two largest nuclear powers aside from yourself, America. I consider that poor implementation of government policies. I consider a person who's an insider trading for NVIDIA, who flies to the country where the stock itself is based, while antagonizing a nuclear power towards World War III. I consider that a poor implementation of government policy. So the word that you're supposed to be using right now is not recession. The word that you're supposed to be using right now is called stagflation. I hope that my video has taught you the difference.